History remembers some rulers for the battles they fought. Others are remembered for the empires they built. But a few are remembered because their journeys changed how the world saw an entire civilization. In this episode of the African Archive, we travel to the 14th century to follow the remarkable pilgrimage of Mansa Musa, Emperor of the Mali Empire. Through historical evidence and the accounts of those who witnessed his journey, we'll discover the man behind the legend and explore how one journey across the Sahara introduced one of Africa's greatest empires to the wider world. This is the story of the remarkable pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. Chapter 1. Waiting for the caravan. The road from the Sahara did not end at the city gates. It stretched far beyond the horizon, disappearing into a sea of sand that connected North Africa to lands many people would never see. For generations, caravans had traveled that road. They brought salt from the desert, cloth from distant markets, and stories from places separated by weeks, sometimes months, of travel. The people of Cairo were used to seeing merchants arrive. They were used to hearing news carried across the sands. But in the year 1324, the stories began to sound different. Travelers spoke of an enormous caravan moving slowly across the desert. They described long lines of people walking beneath the sun, camels carrying supplies, horses for guards and officials, servants, scholars, merchants, and pilgrims traveling together toward one destination. At the center of it all was a ruler from a kingdom far to the west. His name was Mansa Musa. Much of what we know about this journey comes from later historians, including Al-Umari, who recorded the account of people in Cairo who met Mansa Musa after his arrival. Their writings, together with other historical sources, help us reconstruct one of the most remarkable journeys of the medieval world. Before the caravan reached Egypt, the Mali Empire was already one of the most powerful states in Africa. Its wealth came from fertile farmland, thriving markets, skilled artisans, and control of some of the world's richest gold-producing regions. Merchants crossed its lands carrying goods between the forests of West Africa and the cities of North Africa, long before many people beyond the Sahara had heard the name Mali. Its traders were already known along the great caravan routes. Yet the people waiting in Cairo could not see any of that. They saw only the road. Each day, caravans appeared on the horizon, raising clouds of dust before reaching the city. Most arrived much as expected. This one did not. As more travelers entered Cairo, the reports became harder to dismiss. They spoke of a caravan unlike any they had witnessed before. Not because it was preparing for war. Not because it carried exotic goods, but because it seemed to move with the confidence of a kingdom whose prosperity reached far beyond its own borders. For the people standing along the roads into Cairo, the caravan was still somewhere beyond the desert. Its footsteps had not yet reached the city. Its ruler had not yet entered its gates. But news of his arrival was already traveling faster than the caravan itself. Soon, the people of Cairo would meet a king whose journey would become one of the most famous pilgrimages in history. And through that journey, much of the world would hear the name of the Mali Empire for the very first time. Chapter 2. A king from the west. Long before the caravan reached Cairo, its story had begun thousands of kilometers away, to the west of the Sahara, where the Niger River curved through the savannah. The Mali Empire had grown into one of the largest and most powerful states of the 14th century. Its strength had not appeared overnight. Generations earlier, Sundiata Keita and the rulers who followed him had united the kingdoms of Monde, secured important trade routes, and laid the foundations of a stable empire. Over time, new towns became thriving cities, markets expanded, and merchants carried goods across vast distances. By the time Mansa Musa became ruler around 1312, he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a system that connected people across forests, rivers, grasslands, and desert. The empire stretched across a landscape where life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Farmers planted millet, sorghum, and rice along fertile floodplains. Herders guided cattle across open pasture. Fishermen walked the waters of the Niger River. Blacksmiths shaped iron into tools that supported everyday life. Weavers produced cloth that was traded across the region. In every town and village, countless ordinary people sustained the empire through their labor. Trade connected them all. Caravans carried gold north across the Sahara. Salt, one of the desert's most valuable resources, traveled south. Copper, cloth, books, and other goods moved from one market to another, linking Mali with North Africa and the wider Islamic world. Gold made Mali famous. But gold alone did not make Mali powerful. An empire cannot eat gold. It cannot build roads with gold alone. It cannot raise children, harvest crops, or cross a desert without people. The true wealth of Mali was found in the work of its communities. Their hands planted the fields. Their skill filled the markets. Their knowledge guided caravans across lands where a single mistake could cost lives. Mansa Musa ruled over this world. Historical sources tell us relatively little about his early life before he became Mansa, the title given to the ruler of Mali. Unlike the stories preserved about Sundiata, there is no surviving epic describing Musa's childhood. Historians know him chiefly through the records of later Arabic writers and through the remarkable events of his reign. One account, preserved by later historians, records that Musa explained how he became ruler after his predecessor set out on an expedition across the Atlantic Ocean and never returned. Because this story comes from Musa himself as reported by later writers, historians consider it valuable, while also recognizing that many details cannot be independently verified. Whatever the circumstances of his accession, one fact is clear. By the early 14th century, Mansa Musa stood at the head of a flourishing empire. He governed a realm where local leaders administered provinces. Merchants linked distant markets. Scholars pursued learning, and diverse communities contributed to a shared prosperity. Yet despite its size and influence, much of the world beyond Africa knew little about Mali. That was about to change. The journey Mansa Musa was preparing to make was an act of faith. It would also become one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of royal power ever witnessed on the roads of the medieval world. With every step toward the Sahara, the distance between Mali and the wider world grew smaller. And before long, the desert itself would carry the empire's name farther than it had ever traveled before. Chapter 3. The Long Road to Makkah. For a ruler of the Mali Empire, the journey to Makkah was more than a journey across land. It was an act of faith. Like many Muslims of his time, Mansa Musa set out to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Makkah that has long held deep religious importance in Islam for those who are able to undertake it. The journey began in West Africa. From the fertile lands of the Niger River, the caravan moved north toward the Sahara. Before it reached the Great Desert, it passed through towns where merchants traded. Families gathered in busy markets, and travelers prepared for the difficult road ahead. Then the landscape changed. The grasslands gave way to sand and stone. Trees became scarce. Water was no longer taken for granted. For centuries, caravans had crossed the Sahara by following routes known to experienced guides. They traveled from one oasis to another, carefully measuring distance, supplies, and time. A mistake in the open desert could place an entire caravan in danger. Mansa Musa's journey required careful planning. Later historical accounts describe a caravan of remarkable size, including attendants, officials, merchants, soldiers, servants, and large numbers of pack animals carrying food, water, and supplies. Some sources also describe camels transporting large quantities of gold. Historians agree that the pilgrimage was exceptionally grand, although the exact numbers reported by medieval writers cannot be confirmed with certainty. Even the largest caravan could not move quickly. Its pace was set by people on foot, heavily loaded animals, and the need to find water before supplies ran low. Each day followed a familiar rhythm. The caravan moved across the desert while the sun was lower in the sky, then rested when conditions demanded it. At each stop, tents were raised, animals were cared for, meals were prepared, and travelers gathered before continuing their long journey. The pilgrimage brought together people from many parts of the Islamic world. along the caravan routes. Travelers from different kingdoms shared the road. They spoke different languages, wore different styles of clothing, and carried goods from distant lands. Yet they were united by a common destination. For many who saw the caravan, it was unlike anything they had witnessed before. Its scale reflected not only the wealth of the Mali Empire, but also its ability to organize and sustain a journey across one of the world's most demanding landscapes. As the weeks passed, the caravan drew closer to Egypt. Word traveled ahead of it. Merchants arriving from the desert spoke of the ruler from the far west whose procession seemed to stretch across the horizon. Each retelling added to the growing curiosity in Cairo. Soon, the city would no longer rely on rumors. Its people would see the caravan with their own eyes. And what happened next would ensure that the name of Mali was remembered far beyond the deserts it had crossed. Chapter 4. When gold reached Cairo. By the time the caravan arrived in Cairo, its reputation had arrived first. For days, people had heard reports from merchants and travelers coming down from the desert. They spoke of a ruler from West Africa whose procession seemed to have no end. What had sounded like rumor was now passing through the city gates. The ruler was Mansa Musa. His pilgrimage brought him to one of the greatest cities of the medieval Islamic world. A center of trade, learning, and government where people from Africa, the Middle East, and beyond cross paths every day. Even in a city accustomed to receiving important visitors, Mansa Musa's arrival stood apart. Much of what historians know about his time in Cairo comes from later writers, especially Al-Umari. Al-Umari never met Mansa Musa himself. But about a decade after the pilgrimage he interviewed people who had seen the emperor or dealt with him directly. Their accounts provide some of the most valuable descriptions of the journey. According to these witnesses, Mansa Musa distributed gold generously during his stay. He gave gifts to officials. He offered charity to the poor. He rewarded those who served his caravan. He purchased goods for the long journey ahead. Gold passed through many hands. The generosity became one of the defining memories of his visit. Several medieval writers later reported that so much gold entered Cairo's markets that its value fell for years afterward. Modern historians generally agree that Mansa Musa's spending affected the local gold market, though they continue to debate how large and how long-lasting that impact actually was. The exact figures reported in medieval sources should therefore be treated with caution. What no one disputes is the impression he left behind. People who had known little about the Mali Empire suddenly found themselves speaking about a kingdom beyond the Sahara whose ruler possessed extraordinary resources. For the merchants of Cairo, Mali was no longer a distant name carried by caravans. It had become a place they wanted to know more about. News of the pilgrimage spread far beyond Egypt. Travelers carried the story to other cities. Scholars wrote about it. Mapmakers took notice. Only a few decades later, European cartographers would begin depicting Mansa Musa on maps, often seated on a throne and holding a piece of gold, a symbol of the wealth associated with his empire. Yet the pilgrimage was never meant to be a display of wealth alone. It was first an act of faith. Everything else, the gold, the gifts, the attention of the wider world, followed because of the journey. When Mansa Musa continued toward Makkah, he left Cairo with less gold than he had brought. But he left behind something far more enduring. He had introduced the Mali Empire to the wider world. And from that moment forward, its name would appear in chronicles, maps, and memories far beyond the desert of West Africa. Chapter 5. More than gold. When people remember Mansa Musa, they often remember the gold. They remember the caravan. They remember the stories told in Cairo. But gold alone cannot explain why his reign still matters more than 700 years later. When Mansa Musa returned to the Mali Empire, the journey did not simply end. In many ways, another chapter was just beginning. Historical sources suggest that his pilgrimage strengthened Mali's ties with the wider Islamic world. Along the way, Mansa Musa met scholars, judges, merchants, and architects. Some later traveled to Mali, bringing new ideas, skills, and connections that became part of the empire's growing intellectual and cultural life. Learning flourished. Cities such as Timbuktu and Gao became important centers of trade and scholarship. Students traveled there to study subjects that included law, theology, mathematics, astronomy, and language. Libraries grew, manuscripts were copied by hand, and knowledge moved across the same trade routes that carried gold and salt. Mansa Musa also invested in building. Historical accounts credit him with supporting the construction and expansion of mosques, schools, and public buildings throughout the empire. One of the most well-known traditions connects him with the construction of the Jingareba Mosque in Timbuktu, built by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. While historians continue to debate the full extent of al-Sahili's role in shaping West African architecture, there is broad agreement that Mansa Musa's reign was a period of significant building and urban development. These projects reflected something larger than royal ambition. They showed an empire investing in its future. Every new place of learning depended on teachers willing to share knowledge. Every mosque depended on skilled builders and artisans. Every market depended on merchants, farmers, herders, and craftspeople whose work sustained the economy. The prosperity of Mali rested on far more than its gold fields. It rested on the people who made the empire function every day. Farmers harvested crops that fed growing cities. Blacksmiths forged the tools used in fields and workshops. Boatmen carried goods along the Niger River. Caravan guides led merchants safely across the Sahara. Griots preserved the memories of the past while scholars recorded new ideas for future generations. Together, they shaped an empire that became known not only for its wealth, but also for its learning, craftsmanship, and connections to the wider world. Mansa Musa understood the value of gold. But his reign suggests he understood something else as well. Wealth can open doors. Knowledge helps keep them open. Long after the gold had been spent, the schools, the manuscripts, the trade networks, and the traditions of learning continued to influence West Africa. That would become one of his greatest legacies. And it is the reason his story cannot be measured by gold alone. Chapter 6. What remained? Centuries have passed since Mansa Musa crossed the Sahara. The caravan is gone. The roads it followed have shifted with time. The voices that welcomed him in Cairo have long fallen silent. Yet his journey is still remembered. Today, Mansa Musa is often introduced with a single description: the richest man who ever lived. It is a phrase that captures attention. But it does not capture the whole story. No historian can calculate Mansa Musa's wealth with complete certainty. Modern estimates are based on the value of the Mali Empire's gold resources, the scale of its economy, and accounts written by medieval observers. These estimates help us understand his extraordinary prosperity. But they should not be mistaken for precise measurements. His true legacy cannot be counted in gold alone. It can be found in the empire he governed. An empire where farmers, merchants, artisans, scholars, herders, boatmen, and griots all played a part in building one of the great civilizations of medieval Africa. It can be found in the cities that grew into centers of trade and learning. It can be found in the manuscripts that preserved knowledge across generations. It can be found in the trade routes that connected West Africa with the wider world. And it can be found in the memory of a pilgrimage that changed how the world saw the Mali Empire. Long after Mansa Musa's reign, the empire continued to flourish before eventually entering a period of decline. Other kingdoms would rise. Trade routes would change. Political power would shift. But history rarely erases everything. The stories remained. The traditions remained. The scholarship remained. The influence of the Mali Empire continued to shape West Africa long after its political power had faded. Historians still study Mansa Musa because his reign offers a rare window into a medieval African empire at the height of its influence. His story survives through Arabic chronicles, archaeology, architecture, manuscripts, and the oral traditions that have preserved the memory of Mali across the centuries. Each source tells part of the story. Together, they remind us that history is strongest when evidence and memory are allowed to speak alongside one another. Perhaps that is what Mansa Musa leaves us. Not simply the image of a king surrounded by gold, but the memory of a civilization confident enough to invest in learning, connected enough to reach distant worlds, and strong enough to leave its mark on history. The wealth of the Mali Empire was never only beneath its soil. It was in its people, in the hands that cultivated its fields, in the minds that filled its schools, in the voices that carried its history from one generation to the next. And that may be the greatest inheritance Mansa Musa left behind. Because when the gold was spent, the story endured. Thanks for staying with us this far. If this story matters to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.